Yes. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Julio Vasconcelos. I'm the managing partner of Atlantico. Welcome my longtime friend and one of our venture partners here at Atlantico, Hugo Barra, who is going to be talking a little bit about his own experience seeing a few of these different computational shifts in computational platforms over the years. For those of you that don't know Hugo, his beautiful face here joining us today, straight from the TED annual conference, I think up in Vancouver, right, Hugo? I think what we're going to be doing today is he's going to be sharing a little bit about his own experience. Hugo, for those of you that don't know, was VP of product at Google while Google was really scaling Android up through to the first billion users, and then went to live in China, where he went to work at Xiaomi, running all of international for Xiaomi, and then was invited back to the States by Mark Zuckerberg to run virtual reality and augmented reality at Facebook. It was then Facebook that eventually became Meta, which he did for the last few years until starting Detect, a diagnostics company in the healthcare space. So Hugo, I'm going to hand it off to you for the next 10 minutes or so to share a little bit of your experience, because I think it is really illuminating in terms of putting this into the historical context that we're living. Welcome.
Thank you, Julio, and I hope you can all hear me okay. If not, I'm sure I'll find out one way or the other. Good morning, good afternoon, and I think perhaps good evening to some, because we have people joining from all over the world. First of all, it's a real honor for us to be able to host an event with such an amazing roster of folks, especially considering how quickly this came together. So I wanted to, first of all, give a little hat tip here to the Atlantico team for putting this together, and I can't wait to be part of this today. As Julio said in his opening, we think it's extremely important for us to try and bring this conversation that's happening right now on AI, to the LATAM founder community and everybody around that community. As you also mentioned, and speaking of, having a conversation, I literally 5 minutes ago just came out of the AI session here at TED, which is probably going to be the most interesting session of the week, just considering the multi-perspective approach that TED takes to these things. And a lot to share even from what I heard in the last hour and a half. If I have time in my 10 minutes here, maybe I'll share a couple of points from what we just heard on stage. But what I'd like to do really with these few minutes is to start by sharing, let's call it a perspective on computing that my former boss at Google, Andy Rubin, shared with me in 2009, so about 14 years ago, just as he and I were starting to work together. I spent about 6 years at Google and was an early member of the Android product team, so worked very closely with Andy. And I'm going to try to remember a bit of what he told me, in one of the first times that he and I got together to talk about working on Android before I had even joined the team. What Andy wanted to do when he sat me down to talk about his perspective on the history of computing was to put in context the mission that the Android platform and the Android team were working at that point. Why was that relevant, and how was it relevant to the world? And the historical perspective he shared was really helpful to me. So I'm going to try to see if I can bring that to context here as well, some 14 years later. So Andy's observation of computing history, and I've heard a similar story from others, is that the history of computing is told in chapters of 12 to 15 years, let's say. And it's been like that for the past, 50 plus 60, maybe even going close to 70 years now. In that, every 12 to 15 years, we crossed a gate that was a transition to the next major computing paradigm. And it's started, perhaps all the way back in the 50s and 60s when mainframe computers, really started to be used as tools, usually by, very large labs or enterprises, government, and so on. We then evolved to mini computers in the 70s, went to desktop PCs in the 80s, which then morphed into portable computers in the 90s, and of course, the web browser in the 2000s, and developing for the web and so on. And this is me back in 2009 talking to Andy Rubin. And each of these paradigm shifts, we consistently saw a few really important things. We saw a massive step change in UI paradigms, like how people interacted with these computing devices, in developer languages and developer tools, how to build compute-based applications, and of course, distribution and business models. So all three of these things had significant, step changes that came together as a computing paradigm. Now, back in 2009, when Andy shared this with me, we were basically staring right at the face of this sort of new paradigm that we were just entering. And it was a bit early to see it well enough, at least for mere mortals like me. But Andy saw it, as clearly as daylight. Looking back again in 2009, we actually already had all of the key components in place then to understand that we were in fact walking into a major new paradigm. The user interface paradigm shift was what brought us to multi-touch capacitive displays, GPS, which was a major input into computing in the mobile era. Obviously, 3G networks, which made it ubiquitous. You could bring computing with you anywhere and have a pleasant, experience that was reasonably fast. Obviously, all the developer frameworks and tools for native app development, and then the business models that came with app store distribution in sort of the whole smartphone economy, with new business models for with native advertising in apps, freemium, paid subscriptions, in a variety of flavors and so on. And when we kind of look back, when did all these things come together? To try to put a very specific year on it, I think it was 2008, which was when the iPhone 3G came out. That's when we had an app store. That's when we had GPS. That's when we had 3G, all sort of in one box, right? So I would argue that the mobile computing era started in 2008, which was exactly 15 years ago. And I personally worked on mobile myself for about 20 years, about 10 years before this paradigm shift happened in 2008, and for probably another 10 years after that as well. Worked on the software and ecosystem and the hardware ecosystem, and went super deep in both of those. And so really saw this, like, from the front row seat even before the show began. And there really isn't a way to overstate the societal impact that mobile and sort of the mobile computing era had in the world. It has been the biggest and most transformational technology cycle that we've ever seen, period. Simply because it changed the lives of practically every person on the planet in mostly very, very direct and certainly many indirect ways. And so this historical context, I think, is relevant for us to think about what happened and what is happening right now. I thought a few years ago that the next computing paradigm shift was going to take us into spatial computing, augmented reality, and so on. And it may very well be that those will be a future thing that will move us forward. But I think 2022 was a definitive proof that the new computing paradigm is all about artificial intelligence. And the components have mostly been in place for a couple of years, but it wasn't until they came together in 2022 with DALL-E and Midjourney, and of course ChatGPT and so on, that we could finally say, okay, we actually are staring this new paradigm, this new computing paradigm, directly in its face. And just take a moment to think about it, right? What is it that's changing in terms of user interface? We kind of refactored this idea of conversing with a bot that's been around for decades into a pretty reasonable new UI paradigm that actually works really well with the levels of compute that we now have. Developer frameworks, developer tools have obviously been amongst the very first thing to be revolutionized through large language models and so on. The idea of a coding co-pilot and so on and so forth. We are yet to have I think a very fine, crisp description what is the business model transformation. What is that paradigm shift in business models that will allow us to officially label this as the new computing paradigm? So I think that's it. I just wanted to try to put a fine point on what's happening today in this historical context of computing and where we've come from the last 50 years. I would argue the end that 2022 is the 2008 equivalent of the new computing era.